Welcome, traveler, to another journey through the dark corners of Skyrim's history. Tonight, I shall speak to you of Lord Harkon and his Volkihar clan, of the ancient prophecy called the Tyranny of the Sun, and of Serana, the daughter of Coldharbour, who was imprisoned for thousands of years and awoke to find the world utterly changed. This is a tale of obsession so consuming that a father would sacrifice his own daughter to blot out the sun. It is a story of a family torn apart by the pursuit of power, of a mother who fled to the realm of the dead to protect her child, and of the daughter who finally chose to stand against her father after millennia of being used as a pawn. It is a journey through Dim Hollow Crypt and Castle Volkihar, through the Soul Cairn and the Forgotten Vale, to discover the truth behind a prophecy that was never what it seemed. And if you genuinely enjoy this kind of dark storytelling, consider subscribing and liking the channel, but only if you like the content. There are castles in this land that mortals speak of only in whispers, places where the stones themselves seem to drink the light from the sky and hold it prisoner within their walls. I have walked through many such places in my time, but none so steeped in blood and betrayal as the fortress that rises from the frozen waves of the Sea of Ghosts, west of Solitude, where the waters turn to ice and the winds carry nothing but silence. It is there, upon a desolate island accessible only by bridge or boat, that Castle Volkihar stands, and it was there that a king who feared nothing but his own mortality made a bargain that would echo through the ages and bring suffering to all who bore his name. Let me speak first of Lord Harkon, for no tale of vampire tyranny in Skyrim can begin without understanding the creature he became. In an age long forgotten to history, before the calendars we now use marked time, Harkon ruled as a mighty king. His domain was vast, his riches endless, and his power over his subjects was absolute. He was inured by blood, born of this harsh land, though his voice would eventually lose the accent of his people, smoothed away by centuries of immortal existence. The histories do not record the name of his kingdom or the borders of his realm, but they speak of his cruelty, of how he oppressed his people ruthlessly in his quest for wealth and dominion. He was a tyrant even before darkness claimed him, a man whose greatest treasure was control and whose deepest terror was the thought of losing it. For all his power, Harkon was haunted by one enemy he could not defeat through force of arms or political cunning. Death stalked him as it stalks all mortals, and the years weighed upon him like chains. He could not bear the thought that all he had built would crumble, that his consciousness would be extinguished, and his empire would pass to lesser hands. So he turned his eyes toward forbidden paths, seeking answers in places where the gods dare not look. He found what he sought in the worship of Molag Bal, the Daedric prince of domination, the king of rape, the lord of enslavement, one of the darkest entities in all the planes of oblivion. Tradition among cults dedicated to Molag Bal dictated that females be offered to him on his summoning day, the 20th of Evening Star. Few survive these rituals, for the ordeal is horrific beyond description, but those who emerge do so transformed into pure-blooded vampires. Harkon, in his desperation, pledged his entire family to this dark lord. He sacrificed 1,000 innocents in Molag Bal's name, slaughtering them without mercy to earn the Daedric prince's favor. The blood of 1,000 souls stained his hands, and in return, Molag Bal granted him immortality by turning him, his wife Valerica, and his daughter Serana into pure-blooded vampires, creatures far more powerful than those who contract vampirism through disease. This was no common affliction passed through a bite or the contamination of sanguinare vampiris. This was a direct blessing from the creator of vampires himself, but the price was terrible, particularly for the women of his family. Serana and Valerica became what are known as Daughters of Coldharbour, named for Molag Bal's Plain of Oblivion. The ritual that transformed them was unspeakable, an experience so traumatic that neither would speak of it openly for thousands of years afterward. When Serana was later asked about her transformation, she would deflect the question with skill born of pain, saying only that it was degrading, that the ordeal was not spoken of lightly, and that being selected for it was considered an honor that could not be rejected. The scars of that night would shape the rest of her eternal existence. I must now turn your attention to what followed the family's transformation, for it was not the paradise Harkon had imagined. The gift of immortality came with a terrible weakness: the sun. Where once Harkon had walked freely beneath the sky, now the light of Magnus burned his flesh and sapped his strength. His wife and daughter suffered the same affliction, and though they were among the most powerful vampires in all of Tamriel, they were prisoners of the night. The family retreated to Castle Volkihar, their fortress in the Sea of Ghosts, and there they established the Volkihar clan, one of the most ancient and feared bloodlines in Skyrim. Other legends claim the Volkihar dwell beneath the ice of remote and haunted lakes in eastern Skyrim, reaching through the frozen surface to drag unsuspecting victims beneath without breaking the ice. But the truth of Harkon's court was far more sophisticated and far more terrible. Castle Volkihar was no mere cave or ruined tower. It was a palace of darkness, with a spacious main dining hall where 2 great tables were laden with platters of human flesh and bones. Upon these tables lay what the vampires called cattle, living mortals kept in cells below, brought forth to be fed upon by members of the court. The silver plates and goblets were perpetually smeared with blood. At the back of the hall stood Harkon's throne, flanked by his most trusted advisors, Vingalmo, a high elf who had once been a member of the Thalmor before Harkon turned him 100 years ago, and Orthjolf, a Nord whose rivalry with Vingalmo was legendary and bitter. These two schemed constantly for Harkon's favor, each coveting the throne should their lord ever fall. The court was filled with treachery, and even Harkon knew that loyalty among vampires lasted only as long as it served one's ambitions. Yet there is more to tell of the relationship that crumbled at the heart of this dark dynasty. The transformation into vampires did not bring Harkon and Valerica closer. Instead, it drove a wedge between them that would never heal. Both became drunk with their newfound power, intoxicated by the abilities that pure-blooded vampirism granted them. They grew distant, then hostile, their marriage decaying as surely as the flesh of lesser undead. Serana, caught between them, watched her family disintegrate. She had been close to her mother as a child, but once her parents began to fight, she felt trapped, used as a pawn in their conflicts. Valerica would speak ill of Harkon to her daughter, poisoning her mind against her father, and in time, Serana began to believe what she was told. Her relationship with Harkon had never been warm, and after the ritual, it only worsened. But allow me to tell you about the obsession that would consume Harkon completely and ultimately destroy everything he had built. For centuries after his transformation, he searched for an answer to his greatest remaining weakness, the sun. He could not rest while that burning eye in the sky limited his dominion to the hours of darkness. Then, in his researches, he uncovered something ancient, something that promised to give him power over the sun itself. He discovered a prophecy written by a moth priest who had transcribed fragments from the Elder Scrolls, artifacts of immense and incomprehensible power that exist outside of time itself. The priest had died before completing his work, but he had identified 3 Elder Scrolls that contained a prophecy called the Tyranny of the Sunday. Harkon became obsessed. The prophecy foretold of a time when the sun would be blotted from the sky and the world plunged into eternal darkness. To achieve this, one would need Auriel's bow, an artifact of immense power wielded by the chief deity of the elves, and the blood of a daughter of Coldharbour. When Harkon read those words, his eyes turned to his own daughter. Serana was a daughter of Coldharbour. Her blood was the key to fulfilling the prophecy. He did not think of her as his child in that moment. He thought of her as a means to an end. The prophecy consumed him. He gathered 2 of the 3 Elder Scrolls needed to understand the full ritual, and he began preparations to sacrifice Serana and use her blood to corrupt Auriel's bow. But Valerica learned of his plans. Whatever love she had once held for Harkon turned to horror when she realized he intended to murder their daughter for power. She was no saint herself, for she too was power-hungry and had participated in the sacrifices that earned Molag Bal's favor. But she drew a line at her daughter's life. She began to work in secret, spending long hours in her alchemical garden in the castle courtyard, avoiding Serana's visits, preparing something. What Valerica understood, which Harkon in his madness could not see, was that fulfilling the prophecy would doom vampires rather than elevate them. She reasoned that if eternal night fell, mortals would not simply accept it. They would raise armies and wage war against vampire kind until every last one was hunted down and destroyed. Vampires had survived for millennia by living in the shadows, feeding discreetly, remaining myths and rumors. To call such attention to their kind would be suicide. She tried to make Harkon see this, but he would not listen. His obsession had blinded him to all reason. So Valerica made a terrible choice. She took Serana and one of the Elder Scrolls, the one that spoke of the potency of ancient blood, and she hid her daughter away in a place where Harkon would never find her. Deep in the mountains east of Morthal, in a cave called Dim Hollow Crypt, she sealed Serana in a stone sarcophagus within a monolith of ancient design. The crypt was protected by a puzzle involving braziers arranged around a pedestal, and only by solving this puzzle could the monolith be opened. There Serana slept in darkness, the Elder Scroll strapped to her back for thousands of years. But Valerica did not remain in Tamriel to face Harkon's wrath. She fled to a place beyond his reach, a plane of oblivion called the Soul Cairn, ruled by mysterious entities known as the Ideal Masters. She took the other Elder Scroll with her, the one that foretold the defiance of the gods with the blood of mortals. She struck a bargain with the Ideal Masters, offering them souls in exchange for refuge. But the Ideal Masters are not creatures of honor. They accepted her bargain, then turned on her, sending servants called Boneyard Keepers to destroy her. Valerica managed to retreat into ruins within the Soul Cairn, but she was trapped, imprisoned behind a magical barrier maintained by the Keepers. She had escaped Harkon only to become a prisoner in a realm of the dead, and so the prophecy lay dormant. Harkon raged and sent his entire court to search for his wife and daughter, but centuries passed and they found nothing. He refused to give up hope, but as the years became decades, and the decades became centuries, and the centuries became millennia, even his obsession began to waver. He sat upon his throne in Castle Volkihar, surrounded by courtiers who feared him and plotted against him, ruler of a kingdom of shadows, waiting for a sign that his long search was finally over. Allow me to speak now of time's passage and what it means to one who does not age. Serana slumbered in Dim Hollow Crypt through events that would have staggered her had she witnessed them. She had known Skyrim in an age before the first empire of Cyrodiil even existed. When she was sealed away, the Dwemer still walked the land, and the College of Winterhold was a place she had visited with her family. She slept through the rise and fall of the Alessian Empire, through the wars of the Second Era, through the establishment of the Septim Dynasty, through the Oblivion Crisis, and into the Fourth Era. The world that existed when she was finally awakened was utterly foreign to her. Empires had risen and crumbled to dust. The Dwemer had vanished entirely. Dragons had become creatures of legend and myth. And then, in the year 201 of the Fourth Era, vampires attacked the Hall of the Vigilant, a chapter house of the Vigilants of Stendarr, an order dedicated to hunting Daedra and their servants. The Vigilants had operated in Skyrim for years, maintaining their headquarters in the Pale and battling evil wherever they found it. But they had grown complacent. They did not take the vampire threat seriously enough, and their overconfidence proved fatal. The vampires slaughtered them and burned the hall. Among the few survivors was a man named Isran, a red guard who had once been a vigilant himself, but had left the order because he found their methods too soft. He had tried to warn them about the growing vampire menace, but they had dismissed his concerns. Now they were dead, and Isran's worst fears were confirmed. Isran retreated to an ancient fortress in the Valathi Mountains, east of Riften, a place called Fort Dawnguard. In the Second Era, the Jarl of Riften had built this fort to contain his own son after the young man contracted vampirism. Unable to kill his child, the Jarl had hired a group of mercenaries to keep him quarantined and search for a cure. These mercenaries became the first Dawnguard, but they never found a cure, and eventually they were forced to kill their charge to prevent him from harming others. The Jarl, heartbroken and furious, disbanded them. The fort fell into ruin. Now Isran rebuilt it, gathered followers, and reformed the ancient order. The Dawnguard would stand against the darkness once more. It was the Dawnguard who discovered that the vampires were searching for something in Dimhollow Crypt. A survivor of the Hall of the Vigilant, a man named Tolan, brought this information to Isran. A vampire hunter was sent to investigate, and what they found would change everything. The crypt was crawling with vampires, led by one called Lokiel, who had already murdered a vigilant named Adelvald in his attempts to uncover the secrets of the tomb. But the hunter defeated them, solved the puzzle of the braziers, and opened the monolith. From within emerged Serana. She was disoriented, at first blinking in the dim light, clutching the Elder Scroll that had been buried with her. She did not know how long she had slumbered, and the world made no sense to her. There was an empire in Cyrodiil now, something she had never heard of. The Dwemer were gone. Everything had changed, but one thing remained constant. She needed to return home. She asked the one who had freed her to escort her to Castle Volkihar, to her family home. She did not speak of what awaited them there, only that her father and she did not get along, and that it would be unpleasant if they encountered him. But let us speak of Serana herself, for she is far more than a plot device in her father's mad scheme. Despite the trauma of her transformation, despite the centuries of imprisonment, she emerged from Dimhollow Crypt with her personality intact. And what a personality it was. She was intelligent and curious, with a dry wit that emerged in the most unexpected moments. She was guarded, yes, deflecting personal questions with skill, redirecting conversations away from painful subjects. But she was not cold. She genuinely cared for those who earned her trust, and she was fiercely independent, tired of being used as a pawn in her parents' schemes. She was a talented necromancer, trained by her mother in the dark arts, capable of raising the dead to fight at her side. She wore her hood outdoors to protect herself from the sun she had not seen in millennia, and she complained about caves even though she had just spent thousands of years sleeping in one, a contradiction that amused her as much as anyone. If you're still with me after hearing this, hit that like and subscribe button. When Serana and her rescuer arrived at Castle Volkihar, they were met by the court in full assembly. Vengalmo announced her return with shock, and Lord Harkon descended from his throne, his joy barely concealing his calculation. His long-lost daughter had returned at last, and with her, the Elder Scroll. The prophecy could finally be fulfilled. He welcomed the one who had brought her home and offered them a reward, the gift of pure-blooded vampirism, the power to become a vampire lord. This was no common infection. A vampire lord could transform into a monstrous winged creature with devastating powers, capable of draining life, raising the dead, and commanding bats to swarm their enemies. It was a tremendous gift, one that Harkon reserved for those he deemed worthy. But the choice that followed would determine the fate of everything. The choice that followed would determine the fate of everything. Those who accepted Harkon's gift became vampire lords and joined his court, gaining access to Castle Volkihar's resources and the training of his courtiers. Those who refused were banished from the castle and cast out into the night, left to find their own path. Many chose to join the Dawnguard instead, standing with Isran against the growing vampire menace. But regardless of which path was chosen, what came next remained largely the same, for Serana herself had begun to doubt her father's sanity, and she would prove to be the key to everything. Yet there is more to tell of the depths of Harkon's obsession and how it revealed itself to all who served him. After Serana's return, Harkon gathered his court in the great dining hall and delivered a proclamation that sent chills through even his most loyal servants. He announced that the prophesied time was at last upon them, that soon they would claim dominion over the sun itself and forge a new realm of eternal darkness. But to fulfill the prophecy, they needed someone who could read the Elder Scroll that Serana carried. The scrolls were not mere books that anyone could open and understand. They were fragments of creation itself, existing outside of time, and reading them without proper training would cause blindness or madness. Only the moth priests of the White Gold Tower in Cyrodiil possessed the knowledge to interpret them safely. Harkon had anticipated this need. He had spread false rumors throughout Skyrim about the discovery of an Elder Scroll, hoping to lure a moth priest north. His efforts bore fruit. An imperial scholar named Dexion Evicus had indeed traveled to Skyrim in search of scrolls to add to his order's collection. The hunt for him began immediately. Let me speak now of the search for Dexion Evicus, for it revealed just how far the conflict between vampires and their hunters had spread. Innkeepers and carriage drivers throughout Skyrim reported seeing the Moth Priest, an elderly imperial man traveling under heavy guard. The trail led to Dragonbridge, a small settlement in Hoffingar where a young boy named Clinton Lilviev had seen the priest's wagon pass through, heading south. Following the road, searchers discovered a scene of carnage: an overturned carriage, dead imperial soldiers, and the corpses of vampires who had attacked them. A note on one of the vampire bodies revealed that the priest had been taken to a place called Four Bears Holdout. The holdout was a cave system where an orc vampire named Malchus had imprisoned Dexion within a magical barrier, attempting to enthrall him and bend him to the vampire's will. The priest resisted with admirable strength, his mind fighting against the domination, but he was exhausted and fading. Those who came to rescue him had to fight through Malchus's forces and deactivate the barrier using a waystone focus taken from the orc's body. When the barrier fell, Dexion emerged, but he was not himself. The enthrallment had taken partial hold, and he attacked his rescuers with spells of fire, fighting until he was beaten into submission. Only then did the vampire's grip on his mind finally break. Once freed, Dexion proved to be a man of remarkable courage and dedication. He introduced himself properly and agreed to read the Elder Scroll, understanding the gravity of what was at stake. He traveled to either Fort, Dawnguard, or Castle Volkihar, depending on who had rescued him, and there he performed the reading that would set everything in motion. But now, let us speak of what Dexion saw when he opened Serana's scroll, for it was the first glimpse into the prophecy that had consumed Harkon for millennia. The Moth Priest held the scroll before his trained eyes, and visions flooded his mind. He saw an image of a great bow, and he recognized it immediately: Auriel's bow, the weapon of the elven god himself. Then a voice whispered to him words that seemed to describe the very age they were living in. Among the night's children, a dread lord will rise. In an age of strife, when dragons return to the realm of men, darkness will mingle with light, and the night and day will be as one. Dragons had indeed returned to Skyrim. The World Eater Alduin had been resurrected and was raising his fallen brethren from their burial mounds across the province. The prophecy spoke of this time, this very moment in history. But Dexion's vision darkened before he could learn more. The secret of the bow's power was written elsewhere, in other scrolls. He saw them in his fading sight. One contained the ancient secrets of the dragons, and the other spoke of the potency of ancient blood. To know the complete prophecy, all three scrolls were needed. I must now turn your attention to the quest that followed, for it would lead to places beyond the boundaries of Tamriel itself. The Elder Scroll containing the secrets of dragons was potentially already in Skyrim, for it had been used in ages past to cast Alduin forward through time and had recently been retrieved from the depths of a Dwemer ruin called Blackreach. But the scroll speaking of ancient blood was in Valerica's possession, hidden with her in the Soul Cairn. To find it, one would need to find Serana's mother. Serana knew that her mother had fled to the Soul Cairn, though she did not know how to reach it. She remembered that before her mother became distant and secretive, they had spent time together in the castle's courtyard garden, where Valerica cultivated alchemical ingredients. Something in that garden might hold a clue. The courtyard had been sealed off for centuries, choked with weeds and neglect, but it could be accessed through the castle's undercroft. A secret entrance in the fireplace of Valerica's old study led down into the depths of Castle Volkihar, through ruins infested with skeletons and deathhounds, past gargoyles that burst from their stone shells to attack intruders. The journey through the undercroft revealed much about Valerica's preparations. She had been working in secret for a long time, gathering materials and constructing something in her laboratory. When Serana and her companion finally reached the sealed study, they found it exactly as Valerica had left it millennia ago. An alchemy lab stood ready, surrounded by ingredients. Bookshelves lined the walls, and in the center of the room stood a portal, inactive but unmistakable, a gateway to the Soul Cairn. Allow me to tell you about what was required to open that portal, for it speaks to the dark nature of the place it led to. Valerica had left notes explaining the process. The portal required 3 ingredients to activate: finely ground bone meal, purified void salts, and soul gem shards. These had to be placed in a vessel and combined with blood. But not just any blood would do. The Soul Cairn was a realm of the dead, and it would not accept the living easily. To enter, one either had to be undead or have a portion of their soul offered to the ideal masters as payment. Serana could enter freely as a vampire, and she could turn her companion into a vampire as well, granting them safe passage. Alternatively, she could partially soul trap them, offering a piece of their soul to the ideal masters in exchange for entry. Neither option was pleasant, but there was no other way. The portal flared to life, a swirling vortex of purple energy, and beyond it lay the Soul Cairn. But let us speak of this realm, for it is unlike any other plane of oblivion. The Soul Cairn is not ruled by a Daedric prince, but by the ideal masters, mysterious entities whose true nature is unknown. Some believe they were once mortal sorcerers who became so powerful that they transcended their physical forms. Others say the massive soul gems that float in the sky above the realm are the ideal masters themselves, or at least conduits for their power. What is certain is that they hunger for souls. Every soul trapped in a soul gem and then used for enchanting ends up in the Soul Cairn, and the ideal masters feed upon them. Necromancers often bargain with these entities, offering souls in exchange for the power to summon undead servants. But the ideal masters are treacherous, and many necromancers who deal with them end up trapped in the Soul Cairn themselves. The landscape was desolate and gray, a wasteland of blackened ruins, dead, trees, and gravestones. Nothing grew there except a fungus called soul husks, which could be consumed to restore health. The sky was a sickly purple, dominated by floating soul gem crystals that drained the life force of any living being who lingered too close. The realm was inhabited by the souls of the dead who wandered aimlessly, as well as undead servants of the ideal masters. Bonemen, Mistmen, and Wrathmen, skeletal warriors who attacked intruders on sight. 3 massive armored giants called Boneyard Keepers patrolled the realm, maintaining the barrier that imprisoned Valerica. Speaking of Valerica, finding her was not simple. The Soul Cairn was vast, and she was held in a structure called the Boneyard, a prison surrounded by an impenetrable magical barrier. When Serana finally saw her mother standing behind that shimmering wall, the reunion was not the tender moment one might expect. Valerica was shocked to see her daughter, but her first response was suspicion and accusation. She demanded to know why Serana had come, why she had brought a stranger with her, and whether Harkon knew where they were. The centuries of paranoia and isolation had hardened her, and she did not trust easily. But I shall now speak of what Valerica revealed, for it filled in crucial details about the prophecy and Harkon's intentions. She explained that when she entered the Soul Cairn, she had intended to strike a bargain with the ideal masters for refuge. She would provide them with souls, and they would protect her from Harkon. But the ideal masters betrayed her. They unleashed the Boneyard Keepers to destroy her, and she barely escaped into the ruins. The Keepers could not claim her soul, so instead they erected a barrier to trap her. She had been imprisoned there ever since, unable to leave but also unable to be harmed. Valerica still possessed the Elder Scroll, but she would not hand it over easily. She needed to be convinced that Serana and her companion were not working for Harkon, that they truly intended to stop him rather than help him fulfill the prophecy. When she finally understood their purpose, she revealed the terrible truth that Harkon himself could not or would not see. Completing the prophecy would not just affect vampires, it would devastate all life on Nirn. Without sunlight, crops would fail, temperatures would plummet, and mortals would die by the millions. The survivors would raise armies and hunt vampires to extinction. Valerica had tried to explain this to Harkon, but he would not listen. His obsession had consumed his reason entirely. Yet there is more to tell of the dragon that guarded Valerica's prison and the bargain he had made with the ideal masters. His name was Durnavir, and his story was one of the most tragic in all the lore of Skyrim. In the Merethic era, when dragons ruled the skies and warred with one another for dominance, Durnavir sought an advantage over his rivals. Rather than relying solely on strength and thu'um, he turned to necromancy, the magic of death. He delved deep into the forbidden arts and eventually contacted the Ideal Masters, seeking their power. The Ideal Masters offered him a bargain. They would grant him the ability to summon legions of undead from the Soul Cairn, making him nearly invincible in battle. In return, he would guard a prisoner for them, a woman named Valerica, whose soul they greatly desired. It seemed a simple task: guard one mortal woman until she died, and then he would be free. Durnavir accepted. But the Ideal Masters had deceived him. They neglected to mention that Valerica was a daughter of Coldharbour, an immortal vampire who would never die of natural causes. Durnavir was bound to guard her for eternity. As the millennia passed, his soul became tied to the Soul Cairn. He could never return to Tamriel permanently, for his essence was now part of the realm. He was trapped, just like the souls he commanded, cursed never to die but never truly to live either. His very name, Durnefir, meant curse never dying in the dragon tongue. When intruders came to free Valerica, Durnefir attacked, for he was bound by his oath. He swooped down upon the boneyard, breathing frost and summoning undead with a shout unique to him, Soul Cairn Summon, which called forth bonemen, mistmen, and wrathmen all at once. He was a fearsome opponent, an undead dragon whose flesh was decayed and dripping, whose wings were weathered and torn, whose body was surrounded by flies and oozing fluids. But he was defeated, and his body burned with purple fire. Yet Durnavir did not truly die. He could not. He rematerialized outside the boneyard and called out to the one who had vanquished him, hailing them as Kanarin, which meant vanquisher in the dragon tongue. He expressed admiration for their skill, for no one had ever defeated him in the Soul Cairn before. Then he made an offer. He was tired of his imprisonment, tired of the endless, gray wasteland and the hunger of the Ideal Masters. He could never return to Tamriel permanently, but if someone were to summon him using the Thu'um, he could taste freedom for a short time. He gave them the words of a shout to call his name, and in return, he would fight at their side and teach them another shout, a devastating power called Soul Tear, that could rip the soul from a living creature and reanimate its corpse. It was a bargain between a mortal and a dragon, sealed not with treachery but with mutual respect. Dawnguard was an enemy who became an ally, proof that even the most fearsome creatures could be more than they appeared. But now, let us speak of the Elder Scrolls and what they revealed when all three were finally gathered. The scroll from the Soul Cairn, which spoke of the potency of ancient blood, was now in hand. The scroll containing the secrets of dragons had to be retrieved from either the one who had used it to defeat Alduin or purchased back from Urag, Grow Shub at the College of Winterhold if it had been sold. With all three scrolls assembled, Dexian Evicus was asked to read them and reveal the complete prophecy. But when the Moth Priest was approached, he delivered terrible news. He had read the first scroll too hastily, without the proper rituals and preparations, and the Elder Scroll had punished him for his impatience. He was blind. His eyes had been burned out by the power of the scroll, and he would never see again. He could not read the remaining scrolls for anyone. However, Dexion knew of another way. Scattered across Tamriel were places called Ancestor Glades, secluded locations where the ancestor moths gathered in great numbers. The Moth Priests had long used these creatures in their rituals, for the moths were attracted to the magic of the Elder Scrolls. By performing the ritual of the ancestor moth within one of these glades, it was possible to attune oneself to the scrolls and read them without being a trained priest. There was such a glade in the pine forests of southern Skyrim, and it was there that the truth would finally be revealed. The Ancestor Glade was a place of breathtaking beauty, a hidden valley filled with shafts of golden light filtering through the canopy, where thousands of moths fluttered through the air. At the center of the glade grew a great tree, and beneath it stood a draw knife used to harvest bark. The ritual required gathering the bark and using it to attract the ancestor moths, which would swarm around the one performing the ritual, attuning them to the Elder Scrolls. When the ritual was complete, the scrolls could be read, and what they revealed was stunning. The complete prophecy spoke of Auriel's bow and its location, but it also revealed something else, something that changed everything. The bow was hidden in a place called the Forgotten Vale, a glacial valley in the mountains where the last remnants of the snow elves had taken refuge, and the one who waited there with the bow was not an ally. The prophecy had not been written by the gods or by fate. It had been created by a snow elf named Verthur, a vampire who had crafted it as an act of revenge against his own god. I must now turn your attention to the journey that followed, for it led to one of the most remote and wondrous locations in all of Skyrim. The Forgotten Vale could only be reached through a series of caves, beginning with Darkfall Cave in the Reach. The entrance was treacherous, filled with Falmer, the twisted creatures that had once been snow elves, as well as trolls and other dangers. Deep within the cave was a hidden shrine, and there stood a figure that seemed impossible, a living snow elf. His name was Knight Paladin Jelibor, and he was one of the last two snow elves in existence. The other was his brother, Arch-Curate Virthur, who resided in the inner sanctum of the Chantry of Auriel, the great temple that dominated the Forgotten Vale. Jelibor had served as a sentinel at the Chantry for thousands of years, guarding the way shrines that pilgrims had once used on their journey to enlightenment. He preferred to be called a snow elf rather than Falmer, for the word Falmer had come to be associated with the blind, savage creatures that his people had become after being enslaved and poisoned by the Dwemer. Jelibor explained the history of his people and their fall. The snow elves had been the original inhabitants of Skyrim, a proud and advanced civilization that worshipped Auriel, the elven aspect of Akatosh. But the Nords came from Atmora and waged war against them, and the snow elves were pushed to the brink of extinction. Some sought refuge with the Dwemer, who promised them safety, but instead blinded them with toxic fungi and enslaved them for generations. These became the Falmer, creatures that had devolved into monsters over the millennia. But a small group of snow elves had fled to the Chantry of Auriel, which was so isolated that it remained hidden from both the Nords and the Dwemer. For a time, they were safe. Then the Falmer found them. Whether drawn by some ancestral memory or simply spreading through the underground cave systems, the betrayed swarmed the Chantry in vast numbers. The Snow Elves fought back, but they were overwhelmed. Gelebor led a group of paladins against the attackers, but they were no match for the sheer numbers. In the end, only Gelebor and his brother survived. Gelebor believed that Vurthur had been corrupted by the Falmer, that they had done something to his mind. He had not spoken to his brother in centuries, and he needed someone to end Vurthur's suffering. He offered a bargain: kill his brother, and he would give them Auriel's bow. But allow me to tell you about the journey through the Forgotten Vale and what it revealed, for the truth of Vurthur's corruption was far darker than Gelebor imagined. To reach the inner sanctum, one had to travel through the way shrines, filling a ceremonial ewer with water from each basin in a ritual that pilgrims had once performed to achieve enlightenment. The way shrines were tended by spectral prelates, snow elf priests who had been granted immortality by Auriel himself, so they could continue their duties even after death. The journey took travelers through Darkfall Passage, through the Forgotten Vale itself with its frozen lakes and ancient architecture, past dragons who had made their lairs there, and finally to the inner sanctum. The inner sanctum was Auriel's chapel, a magnificent temple where the arch-curate had once communed with Auriel himself. But when Serana and her companion entered, they found it in ruins, frozen Falmer and Chorus littering the halls. Vurthur sat on a throne behind a wall of ice, and when he spoke, his words were chilling. He said that they had done exactly as he predicted and brought their fetching companion directly to him. He was looking at Serana. He had been waiting for a Daughter of Coldharbour all along. Vurthur unleashed the frozen Falmer, animating them to attack. He brought down the ceiling of the chapel and summoned Frost Atranax. When all his servants were defeated, he fled to a balcony overlooking the Vale. There, cornered at last, he revealed the truth. The Falmer had not corrupted him. He was a vampire. Thousands of years ago, one of the initiates of the Chantry had been infected with vampirism, and when they returned to Vurthur, they infected him as well. He prayed to Auriel for help, for healing, but his god did not answer. Vurthur was abandoned, left to suffer the curse of undeath. His faith shattered, and in its place grew hatred. He could not take revenge on Auriel directly, for how does one kill a god? But he could destroy the god's influence on Nirn. Vurthur created the prophecy. He wrote it into the Elder Scrolls and spread it throughout Tamriel, knowing that someday a power-hungry vampire would find it and pursue it. The prophecy called for Auriel's bow and the blood of a Daughter of Coldharbour. Vurthur had the bow. He just needed someone to bring him the blood. Harkon had been his unwitting pawn, obsessing over the prophecy for millennia, searching for Serana and the Elder Scrolls. And now Serana had walked right into Vurthur's hands. But Serana was not going to be anyone's sacrifice. She and her companion fought Vurthur on that balcony overlooking the Vale, and they killed him. As he died, he gasped his final words. "No, Serana, your own father," but it was too late for regrets. The arch-curate who had created the tyranny of the sun was dead, and Auriel's bow was finally within reach. If these facts has kept you listening this far, and you want more of these facts from Skyrim, hit that like button. It really motivates me to create more such videos. Gelebor appeared through the Way Shrine, drawn by the restoration of the sanctum now that Vurthur's power had been broken. When he learned the truth about his brother, that Vurthur had been a vampire manipulating the Falmer rather than being corrupted by them, he felt a strange relief. It meant that the betrayed were not to blame for everything. Perhaps, someday, they could be reached, reminded of what they once were, guided back to the light of Auriel. It was a faint hope, but Gelebor clung to it. He honored his bargain and gave them Auriel's bow, explaining its power. The bow drew its strength from Aetherius, channeling it through the sun. It could turn any arrow, into a missile of death, particularly devastating against the undead. But its true power could only be unlocked with special arrows. Sun-hallowed elven arrows, blessed by a priest of Auriel, could be fired at the sun to call down beams of light that would strike every enemy in the surrounding area. Alternatively, arrows dipped in the blood of a daughter of Coldharbour, corrupted and turned into blood-cursed elven arrows, could be fired at the sun to blot it out for an entire day, fulfilling the prophecy of the tyranny of the Sunday the bow was in hand. The prophecy's secrets were known. All that remained was the confrontation with Lord Harkon himself. The bow was in hand. The prophecy's secrets were known. All that remained was the confrontation with Lord Harkon himself. After thousands of years of obsession, after the destruction of his family and the corruption of everything he had once been, the Lord of the Volkihar clan would finally face judgment. Serana understood what had to be done, though it brought her no joy. When asked what should happen next, she said that her father could not be trusted, that he would betray anyone the moment their back was turned. She had come to terms with the necessity of killing him. He had to die. There was no other choice. Whatever love she had once held for him had been poisoned by his madness, by his willingness to sacrifice her for power, by the way he had destroyed their family in pursuit of the prophecy. She said something that revealed the depth of her pain. She believed her father had really died a long time ago, and what remained was just the end of something else. Let me speak now of the assault on Castle Volkihar, for it was the culmination of everything that had come before. Those who had sided with the Dawnguard gathered their forces at Fort Dawnguard, where Isran delivered a rousing speech to his vampire hunters. He declared that for too long they had allowed vampires to poison the night and kill their people, but now they finally had the means to strike back. Auriel's bow was in their possession. The gods themselves had favored them, and they had to answer with action. The evil that had been lurking in Castle Volkihar had to be destroyed. He ordered his warriors to arm themselves and move out, for the time of their triumph was at hand. The Dawnguard crossed the frozen waters to Castle Volkihar and stormed the fortress, battling vampires and gargoyles on the bridge and in the courtyards. Those who had sided with the Volkihar clan simply walked through the castle unmolested, though the other vampires could sense that something was wrong and directed them to Lord Harkon immediately. Either way, the path led to the same place, the Volkihar Cathedral, the ruined chapel at the heart of the castle, where a great altar to Molag Bal stood perpetually flowing with blood. Harkon waited there in his vampire lord form, hovering above the ground, his monstrous visage twisted with anticipation. When Serana entered with her companion, he began to speak, and his words revealed the depths of his delusion. He acknowledged that Serana had returned with hatred in her heart, but he seemed almost to welcome it. He questioned whether she and her companion intended to kill him and then turn on Valerica next. He still did not understand. He could not conceive that anyone would oppose him for reasons other than ambition. But I shall now speak of what Serana said to her father, for it was the moment she finally claimed her own agency after millennia of being used. She told him that he had destroyed their family, that he had killed other vampires, all over a prophecy they barely understood. She said she was done with him and that he would not touch her companion. Her voice dripped with defiance. Harkon sneered and told her that she had fangs now, that her voice dripped with the venom of her mother's influence. He said she had become just like Valerica, but Serana corrected him. She said that unlike her mother, she was not afraid of him, not anymore. It was the defining moment of her character. Throughout her existence, Serana had been controlled by others. Her father had seen her as a tool for the prophecy. Her mother had used her as a pawn against Harkon, filling her head with negative opinions and then sealing her away without even asking how she felt about it. Serana had never made a choice for herself. But now, standing before her father in that blood-soaked cathedral, she chose. She chose to oppose him, not because her mother had told her to, but because she believed it was right. She claimed her autonomy at last. Harkon turned to her companion and demanded Auriel's bow. He offered them a final chance to hand it over. If they refused, he would take it from their corpse. The choice was meaningless, for Harkon would attack regardless. Even if the bow was surrendered to him, he would simply use it against them. His madness had consumed all reason. Allow me to tell you about the battle that followed, for it was one of the most challenging fights in all of Skyrim. Lord Harkon was an ancient vampire lord who had been honing his powers for millennia. He attacked with vampiric drain, a spell that stole health from his enemies and restored his own. He summoned skeletons and gargoyles to swarm his opponents. He could transform into a cloud of bats and teleport across the room, making him difficult to target, and when he took enough damage, he would retreat to the altar of Molag Bal and create an impenetrable shield of blood magic around himself, regenerating his health while his minions attacked. The key to defeating him was Auriel's bow. The shield he created at the altar could only be penetrated by an arrow fired from the bow. Sun-hallowed elven arrows were particularly devastating, dealing massive damage to the undead lord. When the shield fell, he was vulnerable, and sustained attacks could bring him down. But he would retreat to the altar again and again, each time summoning more reinforcements, each time healing himself. Throughout the battle, Serana fought at her companion's side, casting spells and raising the dead to fight for them. She shouted defiant words at her father, that it was a tough day for him, that she was sorry it had to be this way, that his life ended there. Harkon, in turn, expressed disbelief that his own daughter would turn against him. His final words as he fell were a gasping cry, "No, Serana, your own father." And then Lord Harkon was dead. His body did not simply collapse. It dissolved into a pile of red ash at the foot of the altar, the same fate that befell all vampires when they were destroyed. Among his remains were items of considerable power: his sword, a unique blade that absorbed health, magicka, and stamina from its victims when wielded by a vampire, and his robes, enchanted garments that enhanced magicka and its regeneration. The lord of the Volkihar clan, the ancient king who had sacrificed 1,000 innocents for immortality, the obsessed tyrant who had pursued the tyranny of the sun for millennia, was finally gone. Yet there is more to tell of what came after the battle and how it affected those who survived. If the Dawnguard had stormed the castle, Isran himself entered the cathedral after Harkon's death. He approached Serana and acknowledged that this must have been difficult for her. She replied that she thought her father had really died a long time ago, and that this was just the end of something else. She had done what needed to be done, nothing more. Isran surprised her then. He thanked her. Despite his hatred of vampires, despite his distrust and his harsh words throughout their time together, he recognized what she had sacrificed. He said that she had done more than what was needed, and she had his gratitude. If the Volkihar clan had been sided with, Garin Morethi entered the cathedral instead. He had always been one of the more reasonable members of the court, a Dunmer vampire who served as a quest giver and advisor. He acknowledged that Harkon's death was a significant moment and that it marked a new beginning for the clan. With Harkon gone, the Volkihar vampires could continue their existence without his mad obsession driving them toward destruction. But now, let us speak of Serana's fate after the battle, for it was not simply a matter of victory and celebration. She had killed her father. She had been hunted, imprisoned, and used as a pawn her entire existence. She had confronted the prophecy that had defined her family and ended the threat it posed. But what came next? The answer depended on many factors, particularly on the relationship she had developed with her companion and whether she was approached about her vampirism. Serana had always defended her condition when asked about it, calling it a gift and insisting that she would never seek a cure. She was defensive about the subject, deflecting questions and refusing to discuss the ritual that had transformed her. The trauma of that night was too deep to examine openly. But after Harkon's death, if she was asked whether she had ever considered being cured, and if the question was asked with genuine concern rather than judgment, she might respond differently. If her companion pointed out what vampirism had done to her family, she would acknowledge that they were not normal even before the transformation, reminding them that they had worshipped Daedra. But if they suggested that she could be her own person again, finally free of the chains that had bound her for millennia, something in her might shift. Serana would admit that she had thought about it but was afraid of what she would become. She had been a vampire for so long that she did not know who she was without it. Her companion could reassure her that she would still be herself, that what mattered was who she was inside, not the condition of her blood. If approached with compassion and understanding, Serana would make another choice for herself, perhaps the most important one of her existence. She would leave to seek out Falion in Morthal, a Redguard conjurer who knew the ritual to cure vampirism. The cure took several days, and when Serana returned, she was mortal. Her eyes, once glowing orange with vampiric power, were now human, though they retained a faint yellow tint as a reminder of what she had been. She no longer needed to avoid the sun or feed on blood. She was free of Molag Bal's influence at last. It was a profound transformation, not just physical, but spiritual. She had chosen to let go of the power that had defined her for millennia, to embrace mortality and all the uncertainty it brought. It was, in its way, the ultimate act of reclaiming her autonomy. Of course, she might also choose to remain a vampire. The gift had its advantages, and she had grown accustomed to her powers over the centuries. Either way, Serana would remain as a companion, one of the most capable and complex followers in all of Skyrim. She was a master necromancer who could raise the dead to fight at her side. She wielded an elven dagger in close combat and cast ice spike spells at range. She could create blood-cursed elven arrows using her blood if she remained a vampire, arrows that would blot out the sun when fired from Auriel's bow. She complained about caves and bad weather with dry wit, expressed appreciation for beautiful scenery, and offered her opinions. On the events unfolding around her, I must now turn your attention to Valerica and what became of her after Harkon's fall. She remained in the Soul Cairn after her daughter retrieved the Elder Scroll, unwilling to leave until she knew it was safe. But when she learned that Harkon was dead, she finally felt free to return to Tamriel. She traveled back through the portal to her study in Castle Volkihar and took up residence there, tending to her alchemical garden once more. The courtyard bloomed with her cultivated ingredients, and she could be found in her laboratory, working as she had millennia ago. Valerica would never be warm or affectionate. The centuries of isolation and paranoia had hardened her too deeply, but she acknowledged that she had made mistakes with Serana, that she had used her daughter without considering her feelings. She expressed relief that Harkon was gone and that the prophecy would never be fulfilled. She even offered to make potions for those who brought her, soul husks from the Soul Cairn. It was not redemption, precisely, but it was a kind of peace. Allow me to speak also of Durnavir, the undead dragon who had guarded Valerica's prison for so long. With Valerica's departure from the Soul Cairn, his obligation was technically fulfilled, but his soul was still bound to that desolate realm, and he could never truly leave. He remained there, waiting to be summoned to Tamriel for brief moments of freedom. Each time he was called, he would fight alongside the one who summoned him and express his gratitude for the chance to breathe the free air once more. He taught them all 3 words of the Soul Tear Shout, a devastating power that could rip the soul from an enemy and reanimate their corpse in a single attack. Durnavir's story was a tragedy, but it was also a tale of unexpected honor. He had been an enemy and became an ally. He had sought power through treachery and been punished for it, but he accepted his fate with dignity and kept his word to those who showed him respect. In a world full of betrayals, he was a reminder that even the fallen could retain their honor. If you are really enjoying these facts, leave a like. It's the only way I know you liked the video. But let us speak now of the broader implications of what had transpired, for the defeat of Lord Harkon was more than just the end of one vampire's ambition. The tyranny of the sun prophecy was thwarted. The sun would not be blotted out, and the world would not be plunged into eternal darkness. The Dawnguard had proven themselves as a force capable of standing against the vampire menace, and Isran's reformed order would continue to operate from Fort Dawnguard, hunting vampires throughout Skyrim. The Volkihar clan, if it survived, would continue in a diminished capacity without the unifying obsession that had driven it under Harkon's rule. The Elder Scrolls themselves, artifacts of immense power, could be returned to Dexion Evicus, the Blind Moth. Priest offered to take them back to Cyrodiil and archive them in the White Gold Tower, or he could be persuaded to purchase them for 6,000 gold. Either way, the scrolls that had driven so much conflict would be secured, their secrets locked away once more. And what of Auriel's bow? The weapon remained in the possession of the one who had claimed it. It was one of the most powerful artifacts in Tamriel, capable of dealing devastating damage to the undead and calling down the power of the sun itself. It could also be used to fulfill the prophecy after all, firing blood-cursed arrows at the sun to darken it for a day. The choice was there, though it would mean embracing the very darkness that Harkon had sought. The story of Harkon's tyranny and Serana's redemption was, at its heart, a story about obsession and autonomy. Harkon was a man who could not accept his own mortality, who sacrificed everything, including his humanity and his family, in pursuit of power over death and the sun. His obsession consumed him so completely that he could not see how it would destroy everything he claimed to be fighting for. Valerica, too, was driven by power, though she at least drew a line at her daughter's life. And Serana, caught between them, spent millennia as a pawn in their schemes before finally claiming her own agency and making her own choices. The tyranny of the sun prophecy was a lie from the beginning. It was not a divine pronouncement or an inevitable fate. It was created by Virthur, a bitter vampire seeking revenge against the god who had abandoned him. He manipulated Harkon across thousands of years, using the prophecy to draw a daughter of Coldharbour to him. The entire conflict, all the death and suffering, was the result of one elf's anger at his own misfortune. It was a sobering reminder that prophecies were not always what they seemed, and that those who pursued them blindly could become tools of forces they did not understand. But from this darkness emerged something unexpected: hope. Serana broke free of her family's legacy and found her own path. Gelibor, the last snow elf, found hope that the Falmer might one day return to the light. Durnavier, cursed never to die, found moments of freedom and a companion who respected him. Even Isran, whose hatred of vampires bordered on obsession itself, learned to recognize that not all of them were irredeemable monsters. The defeat of Harkon did not solve all the world's problems, but it proved that even ancient evils could be overcome, and that even those trapped by fate could find ways to reclaim their lives. I have walked through Castle Volkihar's blood-stained halls. I have descended into Dim Hollow Crypt and seen the monolith where Serana slumbered. I have traversed the Soul Cairn's desolate wastes and stood in the Forgotten Vale's frozen beauty. I have witnessed the rise and fall of a vampire lord whose ambition stretched across millennia, and I have seen a daughter turn against her father, not out of hatred, but out of a desire to finally be free. These are the facts of Harkon's tyranny and Serana's redemption. They are written in blood and sealed with ash. They are part of the history of Skyrim now, as much as the dragon's return or the civil war that tore the province apart. And they remind us that even in a world filled with ancient evils and dark prophecies, there is always a choice. There is always the possibility of redemption. The night is long in the northern lands, and the darkness holds many terrors, but the sun always rises. And those who stand against the darkness, who refuse to let obsession consume them, who choose their own path even when the weight of millennia presses down upon them, They are the ones who make that sunrise possible. Such is the tale I have to tell. May it find you well, wherever you are.